Hi, today we are going to be going over the innate immune system. I recommend that you use this worksheet, which you can find linked in the daily agenda. You will also want coloring utensils and writing utensils. Let's start by going over the basics of innate immunity. Innate immunity is also known as passive immunity. Passive immunity is provided when a person is given antibodies to a disease rather than producing them through their own immune system. For example, a newborn baby acquires passive immunity from its mother through the placenta during development. So essentially, your innate immune system is the one that you are born with. It doesn't mean that you've acquired this immunity through exposure to different pathogens. That comes later in the acquired immune system division that we'll talk about later. Innate immunity also has an immediate and first response to any kind of invasion of a pathogen. So these cells immediately start responding as soon as it is detected that there's something that's in your body that shouldn't be there. So we're going to start with the review of what we learned about in the previous set of notes by looking at the physical defenses that you're born with that provide the protection to prevent things from getting in. Examples of physical defenses include your skin, which is the largest organ in your body. Its job is to prevent things from getting into the sensitive, delicate organs inside. Eyelashes and tears also help keep bacteria or viruses from entering your eyes. Mucus is part of your respiratory tract, and the mucus coats ciliated cells that essentially line that respiratory tract. And the purpose is to capture any pathogens that you inhale and to try to digest those pathogens before they can infect your cells. Stomach acid plays an important role in helping breaking down some examples of pathogens that might get to your stomach through your food. Sneezing helps expel anything you've inhaled, and washing hands helps make your hands slippery so that pathogens slide off your hands so that you don't expose them to your mouth or your nose or your eyes. Now that we've reviewed the physical defenses that are part of your innate immune system, let's talk about the cellular defenses. Today we're going to be learning about 4 of the cells that are part of your innate immune system. There are more than 4 cells, but we are going to be focusing just on 4. One of these cells is also responsible for developing the inflammation response, which we'll talk about, and we'll also talk about a really important vocab term called antigen. The first cell we're going to learn about are called neutrophils. Neutrophils are really important because they circulate through the blood. There are more neutrophils than any other type of innate immune system cell. So they are the most abundant white blood cells of your immune system. They are the first responders. So as soon as you have a pathogen invading your bloodstream, they are there to initiate this response. One of their jobs is to eat pathogens. This process of eating pathogens is called phagocytosis. So they are classified as a phagocyte because they are a type of cell, that prefix cyte, that eats other things, phago. Also, they release granules, which contain antimicrobial proteins that can kill proteins. Let's go ahead and draw a neutrophil. I'm going to start by just simply drawing a circle. One of the classifying or kind of distinguishing characteristics of a neutrophil, so if you were a doctor who was analyzing someone's bloodstream, for example, you would be looking for neutrophils because if you have tons of extra neutrophils, that means that you have an immune system response being activated, which means your body's fighting an infection. And so that might be of interest to doctors. And neutrophils are easy to diagnose or easy to identify under a microscope because they have a trilobed nucleus. So you can see that this nucleus is organized into kind of 3 blobs that are attached to each other. And they have granules, which are oftentimes seen as just like these large spots inside of them. And these are the granules that they will release out of the cell. And the granules will exit the cell and enter the bloodstream, like so. And those granules will essentially attack any microbes and they will cause them to explode or die. Yay. So that's a neutrophil, a trilobed cell, most abundant white blood cell. It circulates through your blood primarily. Next, we're going to talk about mast cells. If you are someone who suffers from allergies, these cells are of interest to you. These mast cells are found in the tissues of your body, and if they are initiated or if they detect an invading pathogen, they will release proteins that are called histamines. and histamine proteins cause inflammation. Let's talk a little bit more about the inflammation response. So I'm going over to this box here. So the inflammation response is when blood vessels will leak fluid into the surrounding tissues, causing swelling. The purpose of this swelling is to help isolate pathogens from invading other tissues. So this swelling in this excess fluid essentially helps trap pathogens in that isolated area. And this purpose of the swelling also attracts other white blood cells, so WBCs, white blood cells. So the swelling essentially draws other white blood cells to the infection site so that they can also initiate a response. Now, we will talk about allergies later on in this unit, but essentially allergies are when your immune system thinks something is harmful when it isn't. And so your body or your immune system, your mast cells, think that something is harmful, like pollen, and then initiates this inflammation response. So if you have allergies, you might take a prescription called an antihistamine, which essentially helps break down these histamine proteins that cause inflammation. So it helps you reduce your inflammation. Let's draw a mast cell. I'm going to draw a circle again. Most of these cells are circular in shape. Here's a nucleus. Nothing pretty distinct about these cells. What is distinct is that we will normally draw histamine proteins just as like dots being released from the cell. So I'm going to draw some dots. I'm going to draw an arrow pointing out. You can even label one of those as a histamine protein. So that, in a nutshell, is your mast cell. Mast cells are found in your tissues. They release histamines that cause inflammation to help trap pathogens and isolate them in a specific area. Next, let's talk about macrophages. Macrophages are also found in the tissues of your body. The primary job of a macrophage is to eat pathogens. They display the invader's antigens on their surface membrane. We'll talk about antigen in a minute. The secondary function of a macrophage cell is to activate reinforcements, for example, calling in the cells of the adaptive immune response that we'll talk about later. Let's talk a little bit about what are antigens. So an antigen is a structure on the surface of a cell and on viruses. Every cell has a unique antigen. Antigens help the immune system recognize self versus non-self cells, like a country flag or a team jersey. So for example, if we were to illustrate a bacterial cell, or if we were to illustrate a virus, on the surface of every type of these cells, we would find a specific protein sticking out of the surface, and this protein is called an antigen. Your cells have antigens, and they help your immune system recognize that, hey, these cells belong here. Just like if you were playing on a sports team, you wear the same jersey as your teammates. So same thing here with viruses, bacteria, and the cells of your body. Each of them has a specific jersey that helps each other recognize themselves. And so these antigens are these proteins on the surface. So going back to the role of antigens in macrophages, so macrophages, their job is to eat the pathogens. And when they eat the pathogens, they then wear the enemy's antigens on the surface of their cell because they use that as kind of like an identifying flag, like, hey team, this is the enemy, this is what they look like, this is what you're looking for. So let's draw a macrophage and illustrate what this process would look like. So I'm going to draw an example of a bacteria. So here's a bacterial cell. And I'm going to draw some antigens on the surface of this bacterial cell. So imagine you got a paper cut, and on that paper were some bacterial cells, and now this bacteria is invading your body. So these macrophages found in the tissues of your skin, it is going to come over to this bacteria and it's going to try to eat it. Nom nom. So here is your macrophage. Here's your big nucleus. They actually have a really large nucleus. And so the job of the macrophage is to search for and eat invading cells or viruses that do not belong. And once they do this, they will actually take the antigens from the surface. I'm going to change color there. Sorry, I had to change color. Okay, so they take the antigen, shown by this green structure, and then they will wear that antigen on the surface of their cell. And so the purpose of this can then be used to essentially activate the adaptive immune response that we'll be learning about later. So if we want, you could even draw a second arrow here that would then say activate the adaptive immune response. All right, so to summarize, macrophages are called macrophages because they are big eaters, and they display the antigens of the enemy, and they alert the adaptive immune response if necessary. Last but not least are the dendritic cells. Dendritic cells get their name from the prefix dender, which means branches, and we'll see what that looks like when we draw them. Dendritic cells are found in the tissues of your body. They also eat pathogens, and when they eat the pathogens, just like the macrophage, they will wear or display the invading pathogens' antigens on their surface membrane. Now, the primary job of the dendritic cells is to initiate the adaptive immune response. So they are what call in the reinforcements, and that is their primary job. So if I were to draw a dendritic cell, and be honest, I have a hard time drawing a dendritic cell, but let's give it a shot. So dendritic cell is oftentimes drawn with like lots of branches. I'm just going to kind of draw it as like with tons of blobby arms. There are lots of different ways you could draw this, but that's the best that I can usually do. Another way to do this is maybe if you can draw like branches like that. I'm not so good at that, but do what you do. And then I'm going to draw a nucleus. So the dendritic cell, just like a macrophage, its job is to detect a virus or a bacteria. So I'm going to draw a bacterial cell here. So here's my bacterial cell. And that bacterial cell will have antigens on its surface. It will eat the pathogen, and then it will wear the antigens on its surface that it can use to activate the adaptive immune response, just like the macrophage could. Now that we've talked about the innate immune system in terms of the 4 cells, the inflammation response, and antigens, let's illustrate what this looks like as if it was happening in real time. Let's start on the left side, where we'll be exploring what does this look like and reviewing where the cells are located if this was a healthy or normal situation. So you can see that we have the outer layer of the skin here, the epidermis layer here. Underneath the outer layer of the epidermis is basically more types of tissue. You've got skin tissue, connective tissue, so on and so forth. So we've got this connective tissue layer here. Underneath those layers of the epidermis and connective tissue, you would find the layers of cells that would essentially separate the blood from the connective tissue. So we have a blood capillary here. So this here essentially represents your blood. So if you want, you could even use a highlighter or a color pencil to lightly shade in as if this was blood. So I'm going to do that with my highlighter. All right, so you can see that I have illustrated my blood capillary by highlighting it red to represent blood. All right, and so the cell that we would actually find inside of the blood capillary is your neutrophil. So I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to label this my neutrophil. Remember that the neutrophil is distinct because it has this trilobed nucleus. And remember that it also contains antimicrobial granules. So these are basically these structures that are full of antimicrobial proteins that can break down a pathogen. That is your neutrophil. Let's zoom up here. You can see that we have 3 different shapes. We've got this one here, which is got like all of these branches. So that's your dendritic cell. We have our large cell, that would be your macrophage, and the smaller cell is your mast cell. Let's start by labeling our mast cell. So our mast cell, we used orange on the previous page. I'm going to do an outline of orange as well just to keep it consistent. And here's our nucleus. All right, so since this is a healthy or normal situation, I'm not going to draw any immune response associated with the mast cell. Now for our macrophage, our big eater. It's a larger cell, big blob, so I'm going to draw that blue to keep it consistent as the previous page. And it's got its nucleus here. And we're going to label this macrophage. And last but not least is our blobby cell. This is our dendritic cell, and I used pink on the previous page, so I'm going to do the same thing here. got these branching arms that come off of it, which is where the prefix dendr means is branch. Nucleus dendritic. All right. So again, to review, these are the 4 major cells we're talking about as being associated with the innate immune system. Let's see what happens when an invasion of pathogens occurs. All right, so essentially what's happening here is that you have a wound. Oh no, viruses and bacteria are invading. I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to color each bacterial cell here with antigens on their surface. So please pause and do the same. All right, so you can see that we have many types of bacteria invading our tissues. Now, what I've drawn here are antigens that are all circular. It's important to recognize here that there are tons of different types of bacteria and viruses that would all be invading at the same time. And so innate immune system will essentially have the same general response to all of these, regardless of the specific antigens that they have. With the exception of the dendritic cells and the macrophages will help use that specific antigen if it's like, for example, one specific type of flu, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But essentially, this is going to be a general non-specific response where we're going to target all of these invading cells. So remember that one of the first responders here as part of the innate immune system is the neutrophil. The neutrophils will essentially be releasing antimicrobial granules. So neutrophils can actually travel out of the bloodstream in order to do this. So I'm going to draw an arrow, and here's my neutrophil. Remember that it has a trilobed nucleus, and it has lots of granules. And what this neutrophil is going to do is it's going to release its granules into the cellular environment. And so you could draw a little arrow coming out showing that these granules are being released. You could even label them antimicrobial if you need to. So, so your neutrophil releases antimicrobial granules. And what these will do is they will essentially kill or eliminate some of these pathogens. So I'm going to draw an X through one. So that's one example of a response here. Now we also have mast cells. So I'm going to get my orange. My mast cells are going to be in this tissue already. My mast cell was kind of just a generic circular blob with a nucleus in the middle. And they are also going to release some things. They're going to be releasing antihistamines. So they cause inflammation. I'm going to summarize that by just inflam. They cause inflammation. And remember that the purpose of this is to isolate and trap pathogens. Okay, so they are trapping pathogens, and this also attracts more white blood cells to this location of ongoing infection. So that is your mast cell. Let's draw macrophages. My macrophages, I used blue. So my macrophage, there would be many macrophages here, by the way, but I'm just going to draw one. So here's my macrophage. It is a big eater. It's going to come around and it's going to devour as many things as possible. That's their primary job, is to devour invading pathogens. And then if they need to, they can also activate the adaptive immune response by taking some of the antigens of the invader and wearing them on the surface so that they can then activate the adaptive immune response if necessary. And essentially that's the same thing that the dendritic cell here will do. The dendritic cell is primarily used as reinforcement activation. It's not going to just swim around eating tons of things. It will take 1 or 2 pathogens, eat them, display their antigens, and then it will travel to the locations in the body where the adaptive immune response will be activated. So this one specifically will then travel to, I'll just say that they travel to the lymph nodes, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Travel to lymph nodes to activate the adaptive immune response. And this would really only occur if this infection were quite serious. If the innate immune system cells and response was not adequate enough in order to fight this. So that's important to keep in mind in here too. So we've primarily got our neutrophils, which are releasing antimicrobial granules. We have mast cells causing inflammation, and then we also have our macrophages, which are swimming around eating as many things as possible. And then, if necessary, we have our dendritic cell that can activate the adaptive immune response. So that is the innate immune system in a nutshell. If you were to think about what is this looking like from a step-by-step, make sure that you're practicing your vocab. We've got some great Quizlet sets that go with these. Drawing these could also be really helpful if you want to make your own. Send Mrs. Conitz and I messages if you have questions. Otherwise, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.